On September 2nd, 1642, 2 weeks after Charles I raised his army, signaling the start of the English Civil War, the theaters were ordered to be closed by Parliament. 4 months later, a group of sharers from the Cockpit, Blackfriars, and Salisbury courthouses produced a pamphlet called the Actors Remonstrance, or complaint, for the silencing of their profession and banishment from their several playhouses. Before we approach this text, I will need to briefly cover a few other important texts and some quick history. In 1625, Charles I succeeds the throne and becomes the King of England. To the Puritans in the English Parliament, this was a problem. You see, Charles had married Henrietta Maria, and she was a Catholic. After the plot of Guy Fawkes in 1605, Catholics were thought of as conspirators, out to see an end to Protestantism. So having a Catholic wife in the bed of their king caused some disquiet. As a result, in 1629, Charles decides that he will rule without the help of Parliament, and the next 11 years are known as the time of personal rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny, depending on who you ask. Tensions also ran high between the Puritans and the playhouses, since the actors were supported by the king and gave the king their support in return. In 1632, a Puritan by the name of William Prynne wrote a pamphlet called Histriomastix, which attacked stage plays as sinful, heathenish, lewd, ungodly spectacles, and most pernicious corruptions. While women were not allowed at this time to act on public stages, they could act in private gatherings. Prynne called these women notorious whores. It just so happened that the king's wife the next year in 1633 took part in such a play. As a result, Prynne is found guilty of sedition and sentenced to have his ears cropped, to be fined 5,000 sovereigns, and then to be imprisoned for life. In 1639, the king, having lost the First Bishops' War, recalled Parliament in order to ask for more money to go back to war and try again. However, they had a lot of complaints stacked up over the last 11 years, and they wanted Charles to address them. It's important to note that the Bishops' War was fought because Charles was using the power of his throne to force Scotland to change their religious practices, and Parliament's complaints were also that Charles had been acting the part of a tyrant. The king, true to his role, dismissed Parliament, did not receive their aid, and went off to lose the Second Bishops' War. Finally, in 1641, the king, broke and in need of support, reinstates Parliament again. With this new power, Parliament sets about abolishing the Star Chamber and the High Commission, two obstacles that had in the past stood in the way of Parliament's desires, one of which being the closing of the theaters. The actors took notice and produced a pamphlet called The Stage Player's Complaint, written as a dialogue between two well-known actors, Reed and Kane. Here, the actors accurately predict that they and the bishop members of Parliament might be the next targets. So they offer up reasons why the playhouses are needed in society. They basically say that plays provide relaxed, clever, and educational entertainment, and that it's far better for people to spend their time and money in playhouses than on drinks or sex. Reed then says, well, in a word, we are so needful for the common good that in some respect it were almost a sin to put us down. This statement is meant to mock the Puritan portion of Parliament that believe the playhouses are full of sin and therefore need to be closed. The actors go on to lament how their lives are like tragedies due to their recent poor income as a result of the plague. Finally, Kane concludes, well, the best remedy that I can imagine for our present calamity is to down on our knees humbly and pray God to abate the sickness. The pamphlet ends with the prayer, from plague, pestilence, and famine, from battle, murder, and sudden death, good Lord, deliver us. This is particularly interesting because when Parliament later closes the theaters, they say it will give people more time to be at home in prayer and repentance. This idea might have been meant to mock the stage player's complaint in return. Feeling empowered, Parliament passes the Grand Remonstrance by a narrow margin of 159 to 148. It listed 204 separate points of objections with the king's foreign, financial, legal, and religious policies, and, as predicted, it called for the removal of all bishops from Parliament. It was inspired by the king's soft stance on the recent Catholic uprising in Ireland and the Portadown massacre of 100 Protestants. After reading the Grand Remonstrance, Charles entered the Parliament while in session and tried to arrest his enemies. He fails.
The king is coming with a warrant to arrest you, John Hampden, Henry Ireton, Sir Arthur Heselrigg, and Oliver Cromwell on a charge of high treason. I suggest you leave immediately.
My lord! Gentlemen! The king comes! He comes with 100 men at arms!
I have here a warrant for the arrest of 5 members of this house. I see that the birds have flown.
Are you aware that by your action in this house today, you may have pushed this nation to the brink of civil war?
Parliament takes control of the army, Charles flees and builds an army of his own, the English Civil War begins, and the theaters are closed. The Actors Remonstrance continues this dialogue between the Parliament and the stage. The pamphlet is written in 5 sections like the 5 acts of a play, and it is a mock petition for the reopening of the playhouses. Its title implies the political tone of the pamphlet, as it is a response to Parliament's The Grand Remonstrance. The first section, or Act 1, starts by addressing not Parliament, but instead Apollo, the god of music and poetry, and the Muses, the inspirational goddesses of creativity. It does so because Parliament, or those powers who confined us to silence, have already made clear that they won't listen to reason. It's important to note that this is no longer a prayer to God, but instead to the days of antiquity when plays were embraced, instead of condemned by Puritan Christians. The intercession by the Muses, then, might not be directly meant for Parliament, but instead as a way to end Parliament through the inspiration of the audience, as in the public, to join the war and fight for the king. The actors saw this as the only way for the stages to be reopened. They weren't wrong, as 2 years later in 1644, Parliament offered the king a path to end the war, and one of their conditions was that the playhouses be closed permanently. The second section revisits some of the beneficial qualities of the stage mentioned in the stage player's complaint, and defends against a number of attacks made by anti-theatrical pamphlets like histriomastics. They say that we have endeavored, as much as in us lies, to instruct one another in the true and genuine art of acting, to repress bawling and railing, formerly in great request, and for to suit our language and action to the more gentle and natural garb of the times. The sarcasm here being that Puritans found acting in a passionate manner to be sinful, but it is what the crowds demand because imitating emotion is the true art of acting, and the more gentle natural garb of the times is a reference to the waging of war and hate in the streets. The third section begins by saying that they are so impoverished that were it not for some slender helps afforded to us in this time of calamity by our former providence, we might be enforced to act our tragedies. This mirrors the stage player's complaint in that they relate their lives to the tragedies that they act on the stage, but it furthers the idea by implying that they would either be driven to commit suicide or to exact revenge. As the Puritans are the ones who have wronged them, then they would be the targets of this revenge tragedy. Many of the former actors, having lost their employment, joined the king's army to survive. One satirical pamphlet published at the time suggested that the Puritan leaders write plays of their own and allow for their production in order to decrease the king's army. The Remonstrance goes on to ridicule how, while the nobility and the gentry had used the players as their own playthings, they have now turned their backs on them in their time of need. They're friends, young gentlemen that used to feast and frolic with them at taverns.
I don't want you! Not as you are now.
When we were in bed, it was always in a bed on stage. I'd think, here I am, in a play. Inside, Desdemona, Cleopatra, poor Ophelia. You're none of them now.
Nay, their very mistresses, those buxom and bountiful lasses, that usually were enamored on the persons of the younger sort of actors, for the good clothes they wore upon the stage, believing them really to be the persons they did only represent.
Well, would you be willing to ride with us through St. James's tonight? It would be such an honour to have you.
Please. Well, if you give me half an hour to remove my face and clothes...
Oh, no, please don't. Mr. Kinston, we'd like you to leave your appearance as is.
Both of us were rather wondering.
If you were, really, well, a gentleman.
Well, how then may we prove that I do indeed have a thingy?
Well,
Yeah,
What's this?
a shilling for services rendered.
This strengthens another idea that was developed earlier in the pamphlet, that the people of so-called class that visit the playhouses are the real sinners, not the players themselves. In the fourth section, the playwrights bemoan the loss of their creative freedom and relate their current craft of pamphlet writing to a form of prostitution forced on them to survive. They go on to say that they shall be by that tyrant necessity reduced to such abject exigence. The word necessity here is referring to the orders for stage plays to cease, where the Parliament shut down the theaters as a reaction to the distressed state of England. The playwrights call this necessity a tyrant, to show that the hypocritical Parliament is as tyrannical as they claim the king to be. The conclusion is quite hilarious, as is much of the pamphlet that I was forced to skip for time restraints. In other words, it's a good read and you should take the time at some point. However, I just can't leave this one behind. They claim that if the theaters were reinstated, they would take measures to prevent any of this from ever happening again. One of those measures is that for ribaldry or any such paltry stuff as may scandal the pious and provoke the wicked to looseness, we will utterly expel it with the bawdy and ungracious poets, the authors to the Antiodes. At first glance, it looks like it is saying that any sinful talk that might lead people into temptation will be expelled from the theater alongside the writers of those pamphlets that argued against the Parliament for the theater. Except that this is a pamphlet arguing against the Parliament for the theater. What it really means to say is that they will violently toss out of their theaters any offended Puritans and any of the writers of the anti-theatrical pamphlets. This was because they hoped the king would win the war and reinstate the theaters himself, killing or imprisoning the Puritan Parliament upon his victory. Sadly, or thankfully, depending upon who you ask, this never happened.